Hello everyone and welcome to Unit 5. Today we are going to be discussing states of consciousness. Now in a nutshell, as a brief intro, states of consciousness are just kind of like where our attention is being drawn, what we are actively thinking about in this moment. And so there's this idea that sometimes, have you ever driven somewhere? This is a good example. Have you ever driven somewhere and then you got there and you were like, I don't remember taking the turns to get here. But you were awake, you did it. That may be another type of consciousness, right? That is another type of consciousness. And we're going to talk about how sometimes our attention wanes and our consciousness shifts depending on different factors. And so what we're looking for specifically in this section, we're going to define consciousness and distinguish between high and low conscious states. We are also going to explain the relationship between consciousness and bias. We're going to touch on that. We're going to emphasize that more when we get to the social psychology unit. And we're also going to understand the difference between popular portrayals of hypnosis and how it is currently used therapeutically. Some people have an interest in hypnotism and hypnotists, and we're going to see kind of how that works. But consciousness defined is the awareness or deliberate perception of a stimulus. Okay, so we're looking at something and it's drawing our attention. Right now, your consciousness is focused onto this video, right? So it's deliberate, it's intentional. You have an idea, you have a purpose. The unconscious is thought to be some kind of barrier to awareness or things that we're unaware of. So Freud was one of the first people, not the first. We have structuralism that wanted to look at the component parts of consciousness, but Freud was the one who composed this idea of the consciousness having varying levels, which is best representative on this picture on the right, where we have consciousness, pre-conscious, and the unconscious. So the unconscious is under the water in this picture. You see there's water and there's an iceberg. The unconscious are things of which we are unaware. The preconscious are things in our unconscious that could possibly be pulled into conscious thought, according to Freud. And consciousness is what we can actively think about, what we're aware of. And we had these concepts, according to Freud, called the id, the ego, and the superego. The id functions on what's called the pleasure principle. It's like the nasty little monster in the basement. If you see, it's completely hidden in our unconscious mind. And it's the idea that these are where our deepest desires stem from. The id wants what it wants, and it wants it now. That is the id. We are unaware of those urges of the id, and it works dynamically with the ego and the superego for the presentation of the self. Again, according to Freud. And so after, when we develop, our ego is then developed. Nope. Scratch that. Your superego develops. I think it goes id, superego, ego. According to Freud, but don't quote me on that. But I do know that they work dynamically. Your superego, think of it as like the superhero of your consciousness. Okay, so your superego, as you see in the picture, it's part in your unconscious and part in your consciousness. Your superego are all the influences around you that shape your experience, shape who you are. And some of these things you aren't aware of how they impact you. Maybe you're not aware of how your parents have impacted you, or your religion, or your community, your cultural traditions, all these things, right? Those are your superego. They give you this type of morality. Your morality principle is the main kind of drive behind that superego. What is moral and just? And so the ego seeks to find a balance between that superego and the id. And it focuses on what is called the reality principle. So we have the desires of the id and the desires of the superego to, uphold that morality, which they're kind of combating each other, right, sometimes? And so the ego comes in and says, okay, what's the reality of the situation? What can be done right now to satisfy both of these? So they interact with the presentation of the self. And so discrepancies in this process, according to Freud, results in abnormal psychological functioning. And so that's a quick bit on Freud, always in a nutshell. But at the root of this, there may be forces driving us that we're unaware of. And so this has spawned a lot of research into consciousness. Have y'all ever heard of subliminal messages? I've included a video here. You can click the link and view that. I'm not going to do it for the sake of time in this lecture. But it talks about how the idea of subliminal messaging came around. Subliminal messaging is the idea that you can show people pictures or minor text things and convince them to execute certain behaviors. Fortunately, subliminal messaging doesn't really work. We may have subliminal perceptions where we can kind of take in those things, but subliminal messaging can't make us do something we wouldn't normally do. It's because, think of it as like a force, like a physics question. You have a strong force and an equal reaction. Subliminal messaging is such a minor stimuli that any influence it has is going to be minor. It's not like you can make people do something totally crazy like marketing, show McDonald's on the screen, and I'm going to go out and buy a McDonald's even though I'm a super healthy person. Subliminal messaging is rooted in a faulty study. So, the misinformation spread like wildfire, and even the creator of the study said he fabricated and lied about the results. But here we are years later talking about subliminal messaging, which, we are researching it, but it's not as intense as people have led on to be. Kind of like the faulty research behind vaccines causing autism. We know they don't, but the research and the faulty research, even though the researcher admitted to fabricating and lying about his study, even though he did that, the misinformation was already out there, and so it's spread quite rampantly. But let's talk about levels of awareness. So low awareness, I won't drink on screen, sorry, I was tempted. I love Diet Coke. Low awareness is the idea that you're not particularly focused on things. You're still awake. Like, conscious and unconscious doesn't mean like awake versus sleeping, but low awareness is maybe you're not deliberately focusing on something. So, like right now, I was at a pretty low awareness in the background, and I saw our wonderful custodian James walk by. And I went, right? That's my low level of awareness taking in the stimuli around me. Also, maybe because I'm a little paranoid. I was like, who is that? But we are consistently receiving and evaluating sensory information. So if you've ever been at a party or a crowded room or any kind of event, pre-COVID, of course, maybe someone calling your name, hey, Joe! And the music's so loud, but you still manage to hear your name being called. You're like, that's weird. Right? That's because your body, your sensory organs and your perceptual faculties are at work. They're trying to take in everything around you to assess it. Any alert you to any dangers and adaptive topics like that. Adaptive functions like that. And so those cues are like clues. We're going to talk more about cues with memory and stuff later. They are significant sensory information. They may automatically elicit a response. Maybe we have to think about it. Sometimes we hear something and we go look, like I did when James walked by. Or maybe when someone calls your name, you turn and you look. Maybe you heard someone hammering something at your window at midnight. May cause your heart rate to go up. May cause arousal with your body. This is back to the psychobiology. So even though we're not staring at the window someone's knocking at midnight, a very deliberate high awareness, in our low awareness state, we're still taking in things around us. I won't cover implicit associations tests right now, but this is basically the idea that we have biases that are outside of our awareness, and it uses timing to record our associations with various stimuli to certain people. And so it measures tests based on, if you have any biases towards like heavier people versus skinnier people, older people, people of color, Muslim people as opposed to Christian people. So we have all those different types of tests. They're hard to fake because the point is trying to measure some kind of lower level of awareness bias where you're not like deliberately checking any bias you have because it's not socially acceptable. And so in these low levels of awareness, we're not particularly focused on something, and sometimes they can result in us being swayed by environmental stimuli quite easily. Now, high-level awareness, like this lovely gif, the man, he's thinking about it. This is deliberate. This is effortful attention and careful decision-making. This is you on a first date, trying to listen to their story, looking for any red flags, okay? This is you engaging in an intriguing lecture. Hopefully it's this one. This is you choosing your course schedule. You're planning out, hey, which one can I be home for lunch in time for? Like, when can I be done earliest in the day? You're very deliberate. You're taking your cognitive faculties and you're putting them forth to make a decision, right? It's very focused. And so with things such as mindfulness, you may have heard this term. It's kind of not really a meditative process, but a state of higher consciousness that includes awareness of the thoughts passing through one's head. So it's kind of like metacognition, thinking about your thinking. So if you've ever had a moment where you said something stupid in a social interaction and you're like, oh, why did I say that? And it just bothers you the rest of the day, that's an example of mindfulness. You're thinking about an interaction that happened. It's a high level of awareness. You're taking an event and you're ruminating. The more you do these kind of things where you examine yourself and think about your thinking, like how you're going about a problem in class, for example, the less you are persuaded by irrelevant, yes, yet biasing influences. So think of like celebrities and ads, right? So say you're watching Kylie Jenner do a commercial for Pantene. I don't know if she's ever done that, right? You're like, oh my gosh, Kylie Jenner uses Pantene. Maybe I should use Pantene. And then you stop and check and you go, wait, she's a millionaire. Why would she use $7 Walgreens shampoo? Oh wait, she also has wigs that she's probably wearing. Why would I fall for this ad, right? I'm thinking about my thinking and the biasing influences that could potentially sway me. And the more you reflect, the higher the chance of you recognizing the use of stereotypes and judgments. This is important. Like if you've ever thought something like, I don't want to say anything controversial, but if you saw me going into Starbucks as a white lady, you might be like, well, of course she is. Those white women love Starbucks, right? Maybe be like, wait, maybe I shouldn't stereotype that judgment. Of course, I'm using myself as an example who's very lighthearted. I'm also a McDonald's coffee gal because I'm cheap. But anyway, the point being, you have to reflect on your thinking and your awareness. It helps build that mindfulness and catch yourself falling into like those thinking traps. What else can be said? It is a difficult process. It's not going to happen overnight. It requires a lot of effortful focus on your end. And some people don't feel like putting forth the effort, if we're going to be honest. It's like a muscle or working out anything else. You have to practice it. You have to question your thoughts, question your thought processes. And that's how you elevate to that level of awareness, like regularly. Now, with alternating states of consciousness, individuals switch from high and low levels of consciousness, which we kind of talked about with our example. You know, if you're watching this lecture and you hear something crash around you, right? Your efforts were focused on our lecture, but maybe your dog jumped into something like garbage can and you heard it. You're processing everything else around you. I'm trying to remember what I had in mind when I put the flexible correlation model. That should be on the last page and talking about regarding against undue influences. But flexible correlation model is just this idea that people are aware that their thoughts or behaviors are being influenced by an undue outside source and can correct their attitude against the bias. So that's like kind of what we were talking about with using stereotype. But another example is like political party affiliation. Let me try to simplify this as succinctly as I can. Political party affiliation, like Democrat or Republican, you always see the letters next to someone's name. That is a type of priming where someone is getting you ready to take in information. So if you're a Democrat, and let's say you see someone proposing a bill in your area who has an R on their name, you may think, well, I'm not listening to that if they want it. That's a type of priming. And so a way to fix that is to kind of see past that initial label. And let's say you're voting on a new legislation. You're going to look at the legislation for what it is. Look at the facts around it. Focus your effortful consciousness to figuring out the details of that legislation as opposed to relying on others to prime you and sway you in that way. So that's an example of priming and how we can switch consciousness, especially if you hear a new legislation, you're like, wait, who's presenting that? Why do I agree with that? Do I even know what that is? Priming and flexible correlation model. But basically, in ending part 1, your brain is like a journey down a river. We have low levels of awareness. That's like you're in a boat. In both of these examples, you're in a boat. Low levels of awareness, think of it as a lazy river. The current pushes you on a floating raft and you're just going along with the pushes. That current is representative of those environmental kind of pushes, maybe those biases and those other sources that are trying to sway you when you have that low level of awareness and you're not thinking about the biases. Whereas high levels of awareness, that focused, effortful attention you're putting to whatever you're taking in and the information you're studying, is like traveling in a canoe. You are in charge of the boat. You're not being swayed by the environment. You are paddling, you are steering, and you are directing it to where you want to go. And that's a more effortful approach, but well worth it. Stay tuned for part 2.